One for Mum, one for Dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
Dead, buried, cremated.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared. Won't hurt.
Australia's basically done for. We'll just end up being a third-rate economy. You know, a banana republic.
How good is Australia?
Just follow the money.
G'day and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast demystifying the big economic issues in Australia and putting them in plain English. I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and this episode we're bringing you a conversation with our Chief Economist Richard Dennis, recorded as part of our webinar series. This was recorded live on the 31st of March 2021 and things may have changed since recording. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which I live and work. Canberra is Ngunnawal country, and I pay my respects to the traditional owners and elders past and present. Sovereignty was never ceded here, and it always was and always will be Aboriginal land. So last year, Australia went into recession after nearly 30 years of uninterrupted economic growth. But the Australian economy was already pretty weak before we went into that recession and before the pandemic hit our shores. We had pretty weak economic growth. We had the worst wages growth since the last World War. And the government at the time seemed pretty uninterested in listening to the Reserve Bank and others who were warning that monetary policy, that is the reducing of interest rates for the most part, had really reached the limit of its effectiveness. During the pandemic itself, at the beginning, the Liberal government implemented policies that were completely the opposite of everything they normally advocate. Big government spending programs, including the doubling of the unemployment payment, a massive wage subsidy scheme, that's JobKeeper, and other amazing policies like free childcare, even though that was only in for a couple of months. But really, just like coronavirus impacts some people in the long term and afflicts them with symptoms like fatigue and shortness of breath that really persist for months, the economic recovery from the pandemic is going to have a really long tail of devastation, particularly when it comes to unemployment. So to talk about some of these issues in more depth today, and particularly as we head towards another federal budget, today we're talking to our Chief Economist, Richard Dennis. He's a prominent author and public policy commentator, a former associate professor at the Crawford School of Public Policy at ANU, and he's the author of several books, including Econobubble, Curing Affluenza, and Dead Right, How Neoliberalism Ate Itself and What Comes Next. And just a heads up, there's going to be a new edition of Econobubble coming out in May, so keep an eye on your inbox because we should be sending you an invitation to the National Book Tour, and hopefully we'll be coming to your closest capital city very soon. G'day, Richard. Thanks for joining us.
Hey, Eb.
I just want to start, I guess, with a big picture kind of look back at where we started this whole pandemic. Take me back to a year ago when we were kind of first entering periods of lockdown. Things were starting to get incredibly serious with the pandemic, and whole parts of the economy started to shut down.
Yeah, well, let's go back to February last year, a bit over a year ago. Josh Frydenberg was still committed to returning the budget to surplus. He'd made the coffee mugs. In fact, he'd already told us that we were back in the black, and there
That's
were
right.
AC/DC references, coffee cups. Couldn't be a happier Liberal treasurer than the commitment to or announcement of the delivery of a budget surplus, what's become the holy grail for Liberals. It has nothing to do with managing the economy, by the way, but in Australia, budget surpluses are the be-all and end-all. But to put that into perspective, Donald Trump never delivered a surplus, never came close. The UK and the US, they haven't had a budget surplus since Clinton and Blair were around. But in Australia, we tell ourselves a few strange stories, and one of them is that budget surpluses are the be-all and end-all, and we were on track for a budget surplus in February last year. And then we had to shut the borders with China. Then we saw lockdowns across the economy. And when we first started to talk about this in our webinar series, the first instalment from the government was a stimulus package of around $20 billion, a bit less than $20 billion. And people were beside themselves at the size of this $20 billion surplus, $20 billion stimulus. And I said at the time, put a zero on it. $200 billion is probably closer to the mark for what we need. And, we're heading now for an economy that's going to deliver us $1 trillion in public debt. And I don't know, maybe people on this webinar series thought, oh, okay, that's an interesting forecast from Richard. But I assure you, a lot of people thought that was crazy because we were on track for budget surplus and a $20 billion spending package was seen as enormous. Well, guess what? They stuck a zero on it. We ended up spending more than $200 billion in stimulus, and we're on track for public debt in a year or two of probably close to around $1 trillion. And that's okay. That means that by world standards, we'll still have low public debt. Yes, it'll take years for the budget to recover. I'll talk a bit more about how that happens later. But look, we went into the deepest recession we've had in modern Australian history. And if the government hadn't spent all that money, it would have been far worse. So while the government's initial instinct was to protect the budget surplus, to their credit, they abandoned that. They came out with 20 billion and it didn't take them long to get to 200. And that's good. And that's right. I don't think they targeted it well. I don't think the groups that needed the help the most got it, but they did pour a lot of money in and it did work. There's a saying, everyone's a Keynesian in a crisis. They mocked the Rudd Labor government for building a few too many overpriced school halls. Rudd was right to do that, and the government was right to pour 200 billion in. The reason that so many Australians are in work today is because the government abandoned their obsession with that budget surplus.
Yeah. A couple of things that you've been writing about recently. One is JobKeeper and the end. And you kind of talked about the hit that would have to unemployment.
In terms of the labour market, what's happened is the government spent around $200 billion, as I just said, in injecting money into the economy. Ebony, it seems people can hear me, so I'm going to just keep talking. So the biggest part of the stimulus package was the JobKeeper package. The biggest ever policy intervention really in Australian history. And what the JobKeeper package was a subsidy to employers to hang on to their employees. So when the economy started to tank, a lot of businesses saw most or sometimes all of their customers leave. The explicit purpose of JobKeeper was to say to employers, here's $1,500 a fortnight for each person you employ. You have to give that $1,500 to your employees, but you can only do that if you keep them on. So JobKeeper was not well targeted. We left out groups like workers on temporary visas. We left out the universities. These were cruel, spiteful decisions, and we ended up giving enormous amounts of money to Harvey Norman, for example, whose companies thrived through the boom and got $20 million in JobKeeper. So while JobKeeper wasn't well targeted, it did, in a macro sense, work. It propped up a lot of employers. It encouraged them to hang on to their employees. And at the peak of the crisis, there was something like 3.6 million people on JobKeeper. It's now down to 1.1 million. So that's good. It's working. As the economy's picked up, more and more people have come off JobKeeper. But what we heard last week was the Treasury Secretary say that according to Treasury, the decision to scrap JobKeeper will lead to between 100,000 and 150,000 people losing their jobs. To put that into perspective, that's 3 times the size of the entire coal mining workforce. So for a government that says jobs, jobs, jobs all the time, to announce the end of JobKeeper and say it'll only cost 150,000 jobs, in the Treasurer's words, there'll be a bit of a bump to unemployment. Well, our conclusion was it was more shoulder charge than bump.
Yeah, Richard, just checking you can hear me now.
I can, and according to the texts, people could still hear me. So I was just raving on.
Pleased to hear it. So just picking up on that shoulder charge, yeah, it's kind of hard to imagine the government kind of in a blasé manner announcing 150,000 kind of job losses as if it was of no consequence.
Oh, absolutely. And again, jobs is allegedly the Prime Minister's mantra. So next time you hear a government say we can't afford to tackle climate change because someone might lose their job, just remind them of the time they scrapped JobKeeper, knowing that it would cost between 100,000 and 150,000 jobs. It makes a mockery of their alleged concern with jobs. And to be clear, we should always be concerned about unemployment, whether it's because photo development labs and video stores shut down because of new technology, whether it's because the coalition drove the car industry offshore, whether it's because of coronavirus, or whether it's because the world doesn't want to buy coal anymore. We should always be generous to those who are unemployed. We should always invest in their retraining. But we should never allow the debate to return to this thing where we suggest that the best way to help create jobs is to cause climate change. People do lose their jobs all the time. And if we're always nice to them, then we wouldn't have to worry about the transition away from climate change, away from fossil fuels.
No, that's a really good point. And I just, while we're talking about unemployment, want to ask you about what are the reasons why we care about unemployment, firstly, as an economist, but secondly, why everyone should care about it all the time?
Yeah, look, unemployment is, I think, as an economist, I think unemployment is the most important macroeconomic problem. Because by definition, unemployed people are people who are saying, I would like to work, I'd like to make something. And if I made something, we'd all have more stuff. So economics is about the efficient allocation of scarce resources. Having 500,000 or 1 million people unemployed means having an enormous waste of resources. But in Australia for the last 30 years, we've been far more worried about keeping inflation low than we have been worried about keeping unemployment low. So we've kind of got used to the idea of mass unemployment. In fact, when we have around 5% unemployment, so around 600, 700,000 unemployed people, we actually refer to having 600,000 unemployed people as full employment. That's not full employment. Full employment is when everyone that wants a job has got a job. So having unemployed people is an enormous waste of a scarce economic resource, but it's also an enormous cause of social disadvantage. So because the way we allocate money to people is in part related to how much work they do and what kind of work they do, when people become unemployed, we don't give them much money. And unless they've got family wealth to draw on, unless they've got a partner's income to draw on, they have to rely very heavily on what is one of the most meagre unemployment benefits in the developed world. So unemployment's an economic problem because it's people literally we're wasting a precious resource, and we're imposing huge cost and inequality on that small group of people.
Yeah. The other big spending program that the government implemented last year that I want to talk about is, of course, Job Seeker, which I think ends today. The Australia Institute has new research out showing that cut to Job Seeker is going to push a further 155,000 people into poverty, including 20,000 children. So at the time when they instituted it, Richard, the Morrison government lifted, I think, more people probably out of poverty more quickly than probably almost any other government in history. But now they're making a deliberate decision to return all of those people in a job market where, as you say, there just aren't enough jobs for everyone who wants one. We're deliberately putting them into poverty.
Yep, that's exactly right. So we learned so many lessons during the crisis. We learned that budget deficits aren't the be-all and end-all. Budget surpluses aren't the be-all and end-all. We learned that the Liberals can deliver a $200 billion deficit, and that's okay. And that's good. They were right. They were wrong to worry in the first place. They're right to believe that a surplus isn't the be-all and end-all. That's good. What we also learnt was that we could one of the richest countries in the world, we could afford to give people free childcare, which we did at the beginning of the pandemic crisis. Of course, we removed it again, but we proved it's possible. We proved it's doable. After 20 years of pushing for increased unemployment benefits and being told we, quote, couldn't afford to do it, apparently we could afford to do it in the middle of an economic crisis. We virtually doubled unemployment benefits by introducing the COVID supplement. And now that there's only 780,000 unemployed people, now that there's only 4 unemployed people for every job vacancy, now that there's only 1 million underemployed people, the government said, oh, well, that supplement's got to go, because if we don't, and this is the argument, if we don't get rid of the supplement, people won't have an incentive to look around and get a job. So according to top secret data available on the Australian Bureau of Statistics website, there's around 4 unemployed people for every job vacancy in Australia. Right? There's not a whole bunch of jobs sitting out there and there's too many lazy people to apply for them. There's around 4 unemployed people for every job vacancy, and there's around 1 million people who are underemployed. They've got a job, but they want more work. Yet the government's looking us in the eye and saying, look, the reason we have to be nasty to the unemployed, the reason we have to cut the incomes of the lowest income people in Australia, the reason that those who lost their job through no fault of their own should now go without as much money, is because we're afraid they're all so lazy that if we don't make their life a brutal horror, they won't go and try and get one of the handful of jobs that are going out there. It's complete nonsense. Like, let's be clear, the government is simultaneously saying, look how many jobs are being created. Well, okay, well done. You created all those jobs when unemployment benefits were high. So there's clearly no relationship between having the co-payment for unemployment and the ability to create a lot of jobs. It's just nasty and cruel. There is no reason from a financial point of view we can't afford to do it. It's not true. And there's no evidence that a high unemployment benefit, higher than it used to be, unemployment benefit is in any way impeding the ability of employers to find staff. It's just nonsense.
And speaking of cruel, I think they've increased the obligation on people on that payment to look for to apply for even more jobs as part of mutual obligation. But I want to pick up on the free childcare for a moment, Richard. I know we've been thinking a lot at the Australia Institute about looking at the budget with a bit of an eye towards the gender disparity and whether or not enough things are being targeted towards women's economic outcomes. But we've already talked about free childcare, the fact that we can do it, but just remind us of the reasons that that's a good economic policy.
Look, the data is overwhelmingly clear. Let me choose my words carefully. Of all the policy ideas floating around, I don't think any idea has as much agreement from professional economists as the assertion that making childcare much cheaper or free is one of the easiest ways to boost job creation and, in fact, grow the economy. It's kind of unarguable. The only reason we haven't done it in Australia is that we don't want to, right? So let's take the Nordic countries, for example, where childcare is either free or very cheap. They have much higher participation rates amongst women of child rearing ages, much higher. And we've calculated that if Australia had the labour force participation rates that they have amongst women in the Nordic countries, that GDP in Australia would be around $60 billion a year bigger. So let's think it through. If we spent more money employing more people to work in childcare, we've directly created jobs. Okay, so free childcare is labour intensive, more people using it, we would create jobs at the first step. Guess what childcare workers do with their wages? They spend it in shops just like coal miners do. So there's indirect job creation associated with it. That's step 2. But the real magic is step 3, where a whole bunch of parents, brackets most often women, if childcare is free, they're then more able, willing and able to offer their time to the labour market and do more paid work. So there's 3 very clear very clear economic benefits that come from providing free childcare. Direct job creation in the childcare sector, which is disproportionately female, the indirect job creation from all those workers spending their extra wages, and then the most important of all, the flow-on effect of an increase in labour supply. We know how to do this. We know we did it during the crisis. We know it works in other countries, but in Australia, we have prioritised giving tax cuts to high-income blokes like myself, permanent, expensive tax cuts, and no one says, how will we afford that? All right? No one says that my tax cut needs to be temporary or targeted. All right? We're spending hundreds of billions of dollars on income tax cuts that disproportionately flow to blokes while pretending that we, quote, can't afford to provide cheap or free childcare that would disproportionately benefit women. It's a choice.
Yeah. Yeah, Richard, could you just move forward a bit? You've got a bit of light on your face there from the window beside you.
Sorry about that.
So I just wanted to ask, I think you've written a piece for The Guardian today about, the impacts on women of budget decisions and the types of choices that we make that tend to benefit men over women. We are headed towards the federal budget. I think every year we kind of criticise it. Like you said, income tax cuts disproportionately benefit men because they earn more, all of those types of things. But tell me about some of the things that are going to be in your Guardian column later today.
Well, let's assume they run it, which they usually do. So fingers crossed. But yeah, look, it's let's be honest about the country we live in. I said the way we treat unemployed people is cruel, and it is. The way we treat women who've been raped is just, it's beyond cruel. We've seen in the last 2 months how sympathetic the government is to the mental health needs of senior cabinet ministers enduring the stress of being accused of an historic rape, or being criticised for calling someone who was raped a lying cow. The stress that those politicians are under is such that they're on taxpayer-funded unlimited mental health leave of around $7,000 a week. But a woman who was raped, if she's working as a casual, well, she either goes to work the day afterwards or she loses her income. And while we rightly, I'm not for a minute we shouldn't, while we rightly are concerned with the mental health of powerful people in Australia, and we encourage them to get counselling, and we provide all sorts of counselling care and psychiatric care to people who get post-traumatic stress disorder because of, in the workplace, some of the terrible things that happen to people at work or they see, especially in the emergency services. We don't offer that kind of wraparound support to women who've been the subject of violence. And if we wanted to provide domestic violence leave or sexual assault leave, if we wanted to be kind and generous and supportive to women who've experienced that, and if we wanted to provide them with good, ongoing, wraparound mental health care and support, we could do that. But, it would cost a lot of money. And let's look ourselves in the mirror and admit that in Australia, we've prioritised giving me a tax cut over providing those kind of services. And no one likes to make comparisons that stark, but that's what a budget is. A budget is where our elected representatives decide what to spend more on and what to spend less on, how much revenue to collect from some people, how much money to spend on other people. And our budget each year literally spells out the priorities of our society. And the budget this year could, I would say should, but it's a democracy, I'm probably in the minority here, but for me, should prioritise helping women who've been the subjects and victims of violence, especially the endemic crisis of violence against women by men. We could help them, or we could give tax cuts to blokes like me, and we're going to choose the tax cuts. And that's, I think, obscene.
Yeah. to say the least. So yeah, please check that out. It should be up on The Guardian later this afternoon. Keep an eye out for that one. But it does remind me of last year when I think we made critiques at the Australia Institute of the budget that the income tax cuts in particular would benefit men more than women. The government copped a bit of flack for a bloke's budget last year. And I remember several ministers coming out to defend it by saying things like, well, you know, women drive on highways as well. They benefit from infrastructure spending and stuff. But I think the examples that you've given there, Richard, are very stark and very good examples of just the types of choices that the government makes with each and every budget. We're going to go to questions from the audience shortly. I believe we've got about 450 people on the line with us today. Thanks so much for joining. Oh no, 520 now. That's much more than when last I checked. Thanks for joining us today. You can use the Q&A function if you'd like to ask a question. I can see a couple there. But a couple of things before we go, Richard. I know you've just released a report today on why New South Wales needs a moratorium on new coal mines that Malcolm Turnbull came out and supported on Radio National this morning. Can you tell us a little bit about that research? Because we're supposed to be, if Matthias Cormann in the OECD role is to be believed, on our way to a green recovery. Is that where Australia's headed?
No. Look, you know, there's so much talk about the transition away from fossil fuels, but you know, another unspoken truth of Australian politics is, of course, we're transitioning into fossil fuels. You know, we want to open up not just the Adani coal mine, but the Galilee Basin, where no one's ever mined a ton of coal ever. Right? While the rest of the world's turning away from coal, we want to open up a new coal basin in far north Queensland. We want to frack new parts of Australia where we've never extracted a molecule of gas before. And in New South Wales and the Hunter Valley in particular, where, yes, we have mined coal for well over a century. We're looking, if you look at the scale of the coal mine applications at the moment, we want to build the equivalent of 15 new Adani coal mines in New South Wales. So world coal demand is falling. We've got existing coal mines being underutilised. Some of them have been mothballed. And literally at the moment, the New South Wales government is looking to approve the equivalent of 15 Adani-sized coal mines in the Hunter right now. So our research basically says, look, this is crazy. We need to have clear forecasts for how much coal we think the world wants. We need to pay attention to how many railway lines and how big the port is in Newcastle. Why would we actually approve more coal mines than could possibly make it onto the railway lines in the port? And yeah, we've called for a moratorium on approving any new coal mines in the Hunter until the New South Wales government, who has a net zero emissions target for 2050, has some comprehensive plan for the Hunter Valley. And yeah, very excited that former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull was out this morning saying, yes, of course we need a moratorium on approving new coal mines. We need to get to the bottom of this. And why on earth would we scar the earth and dig up new mines when the existing ones aren't even being run at full capacity? So, yeah, interesting time in New South Wales and hopefully federal politics in terms of this debate.
Yeah, I really encourage people, if you can, to have a listen to that interview. It went for, I think, close to 20 minutes, and Malcolm Turnbull covered a lot of ground. It's well worth checking out. That was with Fran Kelly this morning. Richard, you're not into PowerPoint, but you did have a couple of slides that you wanted to share. Did you still want to do that before we go to questions?
Yeah, look, just quickly, if you can pop up that first slide. I'm firmly of the view that power corrupts and PowerPoint corrupts absolutely. But just to give people a sense of where we're at and why it's crazy for the government to pull the pin on something like JobKeeper, if you have a look at that dotted blue line, that's where Treasury thought, that was the path that Treasury thought we were going to be on. And you can see that that's before we'd heard of COVID. So the blue line is the old projections from old budget papers. And the orange line just shows what happened. The economy fell off a cliff. This is quarterly data. This is the amount of stuff we make every quarter. And you can see it collapsed in that June quarter last year. And while it's true that it's rebounded strongly, you can see that at the moment, we're still about $18 billion a quarter, so $80 billion a year, below the path Treasury thought we were going to be on. So yes, the economy is growing fast, and that's good. That's better than growing slow in this situation. But growing fast, coming out of this crisis, isn't nearly enough. So, imagine you fell off a big cliff and you start climbing back up. It's good that you're making progress, but, until you get to the top, you haven't fixed it yet. This second graph is the same graph, but looking at employment rather than GDP. And what you can see is that at the moment, there's about 300,000 less people working in the economy than we thought there would be. So why would you pull JobKeeper now? Why would you cut the unemployment benefits top up, the job seeker supplement now? We know that we're 300,000 jobs behind where we thought we'd be. So, we have to be, it's good that the economy is growing rapidly, but we've got to look at the level of output and the level of employment, not just its rate of growth. Thanks, Eb.
No worries. And there's a last one there, a longer recovery
the third
gap.
one's up. Look, that's just kind of the same as the first one. That's just done on an annual basis rather than quarterly. But again, suggesting, look, we're $100 billion smaller than we thought we were going to be. That's going to have lasting impacts on the budget, lasting impacts on employment, lasting impacts on everything. And again, don't get confused when they go. I mean, imagine you earned $100,000 a year, and then I cut your pay to $50,000 a year, and said, "Don't worry, I'm going to give you a 10% pay rise next year." Well, you're still way worse off than you used to be. So it's good that the economy is growing fast, but again, it's not the rate of growth that determines where we're at. It's the level of output, and the level of output is way below what we thought it was going to be.
Excellent. Thanks, Richard. I hope everyone found those slides all right. I'm not particularly great at sharing my screen. And as Richard said, he doesn't often use PowerPoint slides. The first question that I've got here, Richard, is from Robert Martin. He says, just wondering how much you think the narrative of budget surplus equals good government impacts the popular or the public assessment of good government.
Oh, it absolutely affects the public sentiment because people have been misled for decades. Again, Donald Trump delivered the biggest budget deficits in American history. No one cared. And when he introduced enormous tax cuts and made the deficit even bigger, no one cared. No one said he's a crazy lefty Keynesian. Similarly, in UK under Boris Johnson, he's never once said I'll get the budget back into surplus because he knows he won't. So, not only isn't it good economics to suggest a budget surplus is the be all and end all, it's not even popular in the developed world. It's not even popular amongst right-wing governments around the world. So once upon a time, in the olden days, when I was studying economics, I got taught that managing the economy was hard because you wanted unemployment to be low, you wanted inflation to be low, you wanted trade balances with other countries to be all right, you wanted all sorts of things. And Peter Costello came along as treasurer and said, nah, don't worry about all that. If I deliver a surplus, I'm a great treasurer. And he just said that for 10 years. And he just privatized a bunch of assets and said, look at all the money I've got. I'm a great treasurer. Well, he was a good politician because he changed the whole national definition of what success in his job was. Did he set us up for the future? No. Did he invest in the things we need? No. All right. But did he succeed in his own narrow terms? Yes. So did he deliver budget surpluses by selling our assets off? Yep. Does that make Australia rich? No. So it's a very Australian phenomena to think that a budget surplus is the be-all and end-all. It's not even a conservative phenomena. It's an Australian conservative phenomena, but it's very, very important.
Just quickly, that's reminded me, even though Boris Johnson's not aiming for a budget surplus, we did learn a few lessons from the global financial crisis and how other countries made their way through that. And one of the things I believe was that by focusing on reducing debt and deficit too early and implementing austerity programs, it really it made the recovery of the UK in particular much longer and harder for people. Is that right, Richard?
Oh, absolutely. And the Australia Institute, Dave Richardson and Matt Grudnoff and others, we did quite a bit of research during the GFC and after. And it's really quite clear that what happened in Europe was that when the economy started to recover after the GFC, governments obsessed about cutting debt a bit too soon, and they hit the brakes when the plane was still trying to take off. And I fear that's exactly what Josh Frydenberg and Scott Morrison are doing now. Their explanation for why we should have completely chopped JobKeeper in its entirety on Monday this week, their explanation is we can't leave it there forever. Okay, I agree, but why this week? And why not taper it? Why not cut Jerry Harvey off, but leave a whole bunch of other people on? Why not leave it there for the tourism industry and the accommodation industry? Why not leave it there for the tourism regions that are still so hardly hit? So the government's explanation for why they've pulled the pin on it is, quote, you can't leave it there forever. But it's a non sequitur. No one suggested that they should leave it there forever. The question is why rip it up entirely this week? And they haven't answered that because there isn't one.
Yeah, there's a lot of room between this week and forever.
Yeah,
and as you said, they could target it a bit more effectively. So, and the next question is from Kimberly Wheeler. She says, issues with casual and insecure work were exposed during 2020. And of the jobs that are being created, what proportion are permanent or of a stable nature? And what about the distribution of those new jobs based on gender?
Yeah, so good question. The last month's jobs figures, the one that the government was particularly excited about, did have strong full-time employment growth, surprisingly strong. But there's absolutely no doubt that what the crisis has done is exacerbate the difference between, sadly, the haves and the have-nots. There's no doubt that casuals got hit hardest. There's no doubt that means that women were disproportionately impacted. And as I said, there's no doubt the last monthly data we got had strong full-time job growth, but that graph I put up showed that strong growth doesn't mean we're anywhere like back to where we should be. So unfortunately, we spent 20 years making the Australian labour market more casualised, less secure. An enormous percentage of workers now with no sick leave and no holiday leave. It really is remarkable, the destruction that's happened to the quality of work in Australia over recent decades. We used to think of ourselves as the land of the sickie and the smoko and the long weekend. Now we have one of the most casualised workforces in the developed world. So, the recovery at the moment, last month in particular, not bad from a full-time job point of view, but the whole experience we've gone through has definitely loaded up a disproportionate amount of the pain on casuals, particularly women. And again, nice big tax cuts for full-time high-income earners, particularly blokes. These are not accidents. These are choices. And, that's democracy, huh? But for me, they're pretty crap choices.
The next question is from Ken Hart. He says, is the real reason for cutting unemployment benefits that big business is scared that if the unemployment payments are only slightly less than what they're paying their staff, they'll be obliged to increase wages to keep their good staff?
I think that's part of it. I really do. I wrote a piece a couple of weeks ago saying that, for 20 years, we've done everything we can to lower wage growth. We've changed the industrial relations system. We've changed the bargaining system. We've made unemployment benefits very low. Like, low wages growth was the goal of successive governments for decades. And, my line was, now we're like the dog that caught the car and we've just got a mouthful of muffler. Like we told everyone we needed low wage growth to make us competitive. We told everyone that if we had low wages, then employment would grow. Well, the opposite's true. Wage growth is so low that people are spending less money in the shops. The irony is if we increase unemployment benefits, the unemployed are more likely to spend that money in the shops than anyone else. So I think Ken's right. There are employers who like really low unemployment benefits because that makes it easier to have really low wages and really bad conditions. But actually employers would benefit from the government spending more money, and indeed from workers having higher wages to spend more money themselves.
The next question is from Surav Das. He or she, I'm not sure about that. I'm sorry there. I don't want to misgender anyone. Says, hi, Richard. What can the government do to ensure that Australians also feel motivated to take up rural and regional jobs that include agriculture, where it appears there is a current and immediate staff shortage?
Yeah, look, it's a perennial sort of issue, this idea that there's all this great high-paid work out there, picking fruit, and everyone's just too lazy to do it. And it's particularly the problem is all these people in the city that won't move to the bush to do the jobs. And it's a great story and it gets wheeled out all the time. It's just when people go and look, it turns out to be complete crap. Now, the easiest way to explain why it's crap is that unemployment in regional areas is a lot higher than unemployment in the cities. All right, so the National Party represents rural people, and rural people experience significantly higher unemployment than city people. So why don't the rural people want to work on the farms nearby? Why are we saying to people in Sydney, hey, you know how you live in an area with relatively low unemployment? Why don't you move to regional Australia where the unemployment rate's twice as high in the hope of getting a really high-paid job in farming that none of the locals want? It's ridiculous. So, of course, some firms in some places sometimes struggle to find good staff. Sometimes people can't get the IT staff they want. Sometimes they can't find the chef they want. And maybe sometimes they can't find the fruit picker they want. But when it comes to fruit picking, what they're not telling you is that for years we've relied on backpackers and people on temporary visas who basically agree to do very, very, very low paid work in exchange for the opportunity to hang out in Australia a bit longer. And when we closed the borders and those people couldn't come, all of a sudden the people, the farmers that relied on that pool of effectively desperate labour, they don't want to pay minimum wages to people. We made the labour market flexible. We deregulated it. We said, look, it's not the government's job to tell everyone what they should earn. When there's a shortage of IT professionals, the wage goes up. When there's a shortage of anything, shortage of prawns at Christmas time, the wage goes up. Farmers have been paying very, very low piece rates. Like they don't pay per hour, they pay per pumpkin, and the hourly rates of pay are very, very, very low. That's why people don't want to work there. And to sort of say to the unemployed in Sydney, you have to go to the regions and take a job that the regional unemployed people won't take, I think that tells you there's a problem.
Yeah, and I think groups like the Australian Unemployed Workers Union and others have pointed out that, in fact, if you were someone on unemployment payments like job seeker and you moved to an area to take up a job like that, if it didn't pan out, you could be breached for moving to an area that has higher unemployment than where you're from. So there's a couple of catch-22s there for people as well.
Look, there absolutely is. So you can lose your benefits for up to 26 weeks if you move from a region of low unemployment to a region of high unemployment. But also, like our whole kind of discriminatory stereotype of unemployment, and this is the Deputy Prime Minister who said this, is sort of young people binge watching Netflix who in Sydney who can't be bothered to move to regional areas to take jobs that his voters won't take. That stereotype just completely overlooks simple things like, what if the unemployed person in Sydney is a woman with 2 kids? Is she supposed to pull her kids out of school and move to somewhere she has no support to take an insecure temporary fruit picking job? I mean, it's ridiculous to suggest that humans don't have connections to particular areas and that because they lost their job in a car factory, or because they lost their job in a travel agent, they should now just move to somewhere they don't know anyone, to take an insecure job and either drag their family with them or leave their family behind. It's only the stereotype of the bong-smoking, unemployed, inner city something or other that allows the Deputy Prime Minister to get away with this outrageous attempt to suggest he's solving a problem.
The next question is from Darren Poynan, and it says, looking ahead, don't you see that fiscal policy and monetary policy would be on a collision course of some sort?
Looking ahead, all sorts of things need to happen. But looking in the near future, as I put up with those graphs before, like, we are well below the path that we thought we were going to be on. We've got high unemployment. We've got very high underemployment. We need to stimulate the economy. And at the moment, monetary policy, as Ebony said before, that interest rate policy effectively has a role to play in that. Fiscal policy, government spending policy has a role to play. At the moment, I'd say they're in perfect alignment. Some people are already starting to worry and say, oh, you better be careful or we might wind up with some inflation in 2 to 3 years' time, to which I'd say, okay, fine, no biggie. Like, I would actually rather solve mass unemployment and risk inflation hitting 4% in a few years' time than accidentally have hundreds of thousands of people not producing something, not earning something, and going through the personal ordeal of unemployment. So economists argue about this trade-off between unemployment and inflation. I think the argument is overstated, but even if there is a trade-off, sign me up for much lower unemployment and potentially a little bit higher inflation. And by the way, high inflation means interest rates would go up, and that means all the pensioners would be very, very happy. So if you actually want to help low-income unemployed young people and rich old people, have less unemployment and high inflation.
The next question is from Terence Hull, and I think there's a couple of other questions that touch on this. But in the past few weeks, commentators have warned that immigration decline would lead to population decline and also speculate on fertility decline. Do you think Australia has or needs a population policy, or are we in a population crisis?
I do think we need a population policy. I have no strong views on what that policy should be. So what do I mean by that? The Australian Institute's published quite a bit of research on this over the last 10 years, saying, look, we've got record high population growth, and that's putting enormous pressure on our health system and our education system. But to be clear, that's not immigrants putting pressure on our health system or immigrants putting pressure on our education system. What's putting pressure on our health system, our education system, our transport system, what's putting pressure on is a government saying, I want to bring a lot of people in and I'm not going to invest a lot in new schools and roads and hospitals. So for me as an economist, I have absolutely no idea what the right population is for Australia. But if I was going to have 100 people round for a party, I'd put the food and the chairs out before everybody arrived. If we want to bring 1 million people into Australia every 4 years, which is what we were doing, keep in mind, Canberra's got around 400,000 people. Every 18 months, we need to build a new Canberra in Australia. Like, if you want to have the population growth we've been having, we have to admit that every 18 months we need to build enough schools for everyone in Canberra, enough hospitals for everyone in Canberra, enough roads for everyone in Canberra every 18 months. And what we've been doing for decades is bringing the people in first and slowly spending a bit more on infrastructure. So we get this farcical situation that every budget, every state treasurer, Labor or Liberal, says, we're spending record amounts on health, or we're spending record amounts in education. Yeah, but not per capita, they're not. So, yeah, I think it's very complicated. A lot of people get very scared to talk about population. I'm not at all xenophobic. I don't have any concerns with people moving to Australia, but we do need a population policy, because I think we need to have a public debate about how fast we want to grow and whether we want high population growth to mean we're gradually diluting the quality of our services, or whether we're going to step up our investment so that as population grows, we actually get the same or even better services than we used to. But it's wrong to blame immigrants for the fact that we haven't spent enough on transport or hospitals.
Thanks, Richard. We've only got a couple of minutes left, so I'm sorry that we're not going to get to everyone's questions today, but there's a couple of questions that basically say, Richard, what kind of structural changes do we need, and what kind of economic policies do we need to set Australia up for the decades to come?
Oh, in a couple of minutes, no problem at all.
Can you just sort that out for us, please?
No worries. Look, big picture, we need to worry as much about the shape of the economy as we do the size of the economy. We talk so much about how big the economy is, but we need to talk about what do we want more of and what do we want less of. If we want to have a much bigger health system, a much better education system, if we want to have the kind of economic and social outcomes that the Nordic countries do, we can have them. We're as rich as them. But they make quite different choices to us. The shape of their economy is radically different than the shape of ours. But maybe we don't want that. Maybe we want to be more like Singapore. Maybe we want to have much lower taxes and a much smaller welfare system, and go the American sort of catch and kill your own kind of approach. As an economist, there's no right answer. Like, these are democratic questions, but we've turned them into fake economic questions. We ask a fake question, what's best for the economy, when we actually need to ask what kind of things do we want to have. And if we spend more on childcare and we spend more on aged care and we spend more on health, we spend more on education, I guarantee we'll create a lot of jobs. I guarantee it. They're all very labour intensive things. And if we wanted to do that, we could. But let's face it, this government doesn't want to do that. And they won the election. So how do we set Australia up for the future? Well, we actually have to talk about what future we want. Do we want more renewable energy or more coal? Do we want more publicly funded health, or do we want more private health insurance? Do we want to have more cars on the road, or do we want to have better public transport? These are democratic choices. And when you make those democratic choices, they will have economic consequences. But it'd be a bit weird to choose fossil fuels we don't want, private health insurance we don't want, and terrible transport system we don't want, so that we can have a good economy. Like, that doesn't actually make any sense to an economist or to a voter. So we've got to flip the whole thing on its head. We're one of the richest countries in the world. We've got to ask, what do we want? What kind of society do we want? What things do we want more of? Different parents make different choices about how to spend money on their kids. Well, different governments make different choices about how to spend money on their voters. There's no right answer. But it'd be crazy to spend money on things we don't actually want. Maybe like a $500 million war memorial when there's a shortage crisis in domestic violence.
That reminds me of one of Richard's favourite questions on housing affordability is not whether or not you want to make housing more affordable, but if you want it to be more expensive or less expensive, because affordable could mean anything to anyone.
Anything you want. So yeah, but it's hard. If people listening think, oh, that makes sense, but I don't know how to participate in that conversation. Well, think about it. People get angry when you talk about household analogies, but if you want to spend a lot of money on a holiday and someone else wants to spend a lot of money teaching their kids to play the piano, I don't know what the right answer is. But if you hate the piano, don't buy one. If we, some of the richest people the world's ever known, want to have a clean energy network, and we want to have great hospitals that look after everyone, not just the rich, then yeah, like the Swedes or the Norwegians or the Finns, we could have that if we wanted. But maybe we don't want it. But let's be honest about it. Let's stop pretending we can't have it because the economy said so. There's no such thing.
Yeah, and that reminds me, it was just a couple of weeks ago that the Australia Institute launched the National Closing the Gap campaign report for this year. Obviously, that gap still persists in several areas. They've had huge success in protecting Aboriginal communities through the pandemic, particularly through Aboriginal-led community-controlled health organisations. But at the time, we kind of talked about, Richard's talking about what is the shape of the economy, and the fact that we had almost 30 years of uninterrupted economic growth before the pandemic. But really, what is the point of all that economic growth if we've still got a massive gap between First Nations Australians and non-Indigenous Australians, and as Richard said, can't afford to somehow make sure that we've got adequate domestic violence services in place, or any number of other things. So these are all excellent questions, and as Richard says, all very good democratic questions. Thanks very much for joining us today, Richard. It was really good to kind of look back, thinking back to the first webinar we did to kick all this off, which was about this time last year. Thank you so much.
Don't forget Australia Institute TV.
That's right. Australia Institute TV, we launched last week. You can see me here in our fantastic new studio. We've got a couple of TV shows, so to speak, already up, including Richard's Ask an Economist, and a couple of other ones that you should really check out there. There's going to be lots of new content up on australiainstitute.tv, and you'll be able to find a recording of this webinar up there later today. Thanks so much for joining us, everyone. Thanks for all your questions. We really appreciate you coming, and hopefully we'll see you next week. Cheers.
Thanks, Eb.
This has been a special webinar episode of Follow the Money. All of our webinars are free and available to view on our YouTube channel, which you can find and subscribe to at australiainstitute.tv. All our latest research and content is at australiainstitute.org.au, and you can find us on Twitter at the Oz Institute with an AUS. My Twitter handle is ebony_Bennett with a double N double T, and you can find our producer Jennifer Macy at Jennifer Macy. Our theme music is by Jonathan McFeet from Pulse and Thrum, with additional music by Blue Dot Sessions. Stay safe out there, everyone, and thanks for listening.